Late 1942. That was when the silence broke. Rumors began to slip through the cracks of censorship in Germany. Whispers circulated in breadlines and factories. The story was impossible to believe. The Red Army had surrounded General Paulus's Sixth Army in Stalingrad. For a populace fed on years of newsreels depicting blitzkrieg victories, the idea was alien. They could not admit that the Wehrmacht's largest formation was doomed. The denial was total. Joseph Goebbels took to the radio to manage the shock. He announced a German Christmas. It was not a celebration of plenty. It was a holiday painted in austerity and ideological iron. 2 years passed. By Christmas 1944, the capital was unrecognizable. Allied bombers had reduced Berlin to a geography of ruins. The people were exhausted. Rations were scarce. Stress was permanent. Why did the jokes turn black? Because hope was gone. Humor became macabre. One popular dark joke offered practical advice. Be practical. Give a coffin as a gift. The camera records the devastation on the streets. On the walls of collapsed buildings, survivors scrawled messages in chalk. They told relatives, "We are alive. We moved to Aunt's house." Directly above these notes, official Nazi Party posters screamed a threat. Looters will be punished by death. The warning was real. Bodies often swung from lampposts in the morning mist. Berliners lived underground. They spent more hours in damp basements and bunkers than in their own beds. The atmosphere in the shelters was suffocating. Blue emergency lights cast a corpse-like pallor on faces. The footage shows people packed shoulder to shoulder. They wore 3 layers of coats against the cold. They clutched small cardboard suitcases filled with sandwiches and thermoses. Even the ceilings were prepared for the worst. They were painted with luminous paint. When the power grid failed and the lights died, the paint glowed in the dark. A ghostly green guide in the pitch black. Berlin held a population of 3 million. There were not enough shelters. They became dangerously overcrowded. At first glance, the letters LSR stood for Luftschutzraum, or air raid shelter. But in reality, Berliners read them differently. They whispered that LSR stood for Learn Schnell Russisch. Learn Russian quickly. The language of the street changed. Most Berliners stopped saying Heil Hitler. Instead, they greeted each other with a grim wish. Bleib übrig, survive. Fear came from the east. Goebbels made sure of it. Propaganda broadcasts replayed the horrors of Nemmersdorf on a loop. Reports detailed how Red Army troops raped and murdered hundreds of villagers. The fear was immense. The arrival of the Soviets seemed inevitable. Then came a brief flicker of delusion. December 1944. The Ardennes offensive began. The news somewhat revived the morale of the German population. They still believed in the Führer. They waited for miracle weapons to hold the world hostage. But inside the high command, the mood was funereal. Staff officers looked at the maps with dread. They rightly feared the truth. The offensive in the west would drain the Eastern Front at the most decisive moment. Hitler refused to listen. He was obsessed with a fantasy of reversing the war's fortunes. He wanted to force the Allies to the negotiating table. He rejected any diplomatic approach to the Soviet Union. General Guderian brought intelligence reports to the bunker. He warned Hitler about the Red Army's massive buildup. Millions of men were preparing for an offensive. Hitler dismissed the estimates. He was convinced that Soviet divisions were weak. He called the data the greatest bluff. Hitler stubbornly kept his focus on the West, but the threat in the East was imminent. On January 13th, the illusion shattered. The Red Army was not weak. The offensive began. The front collapsed. The Soviet forces were no longer just a rumor on a map. They were breaking down the door. Thus ended the wait. January 13th, 1945. On that date, General Ivan Danilovich Chernyakhovsky gave the order to open fire. A massive artillery barrage hammered the eastern borders. Why was this offensive different? It wasn't just a tactical maneuver. It was an invasion into the heart of the enemy. Before the first tank rolled forward, political officers briefed the Soviet troops. The message was blunt. They were no longer liberating their own soil. They were entering the den of the fascist beast. The Germans fought back with desperation, but the sheer weight of Soviet armor crushed their defenses. By January 24th, The Red Army stood at the gates of Königsberg. The capital of East Prussia was within sight. In the south, Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky launched his own attack on January 14th. His objective was surgical: cut off East Prussia from the rest of the Reich. On the very first night, German General Georg Hans Reinhardt saw the trap closing. He sent an urgent cable to Hitler. He warned of the imminent collapse, but Berlin remained silent. The Führer ignored the reality on the ground, and the Soviet advance accelerated. At first glance, a military defeat, but in reality, a complete administrative collapse. Gauleiter Erich Koch was responsible for the region. He had the power to save lives. Instead, he doomed them. Koch refused to authorize evacuation orders. Civilians waited for a signal that never came. Coordination with the Wehrmacht disintegrated. It got worse. Koch diverted refugee trains directly into areas already seized by Soviet tanks. He sent thousands into a trap. But when the artillery shells began landing near his own headquarters, his loyalty vanished. Koch packed his bags and fled west. He left the civilians to face the Red Army alone. The population panicked. They fled into the white void. Temperatures dropped well below freezing. The roads became graveyards. The camera records: bodies lying frozen in the snowdrifts. In one village, NKVD units discovered a grim scene. 100 civilian corpses were scattered across the ice. These were victims of a death march. The bodies were women. 6 pointed stars were sewn onto their ragged clothes. Each had been shot at point-blank range. The advancing Red Army responded with widespread violence. Reports of rape and looting flooded the command centers. For the Soviet soldier, this was personal. They viewed every German as a target for revenge. They remembered the Nazi atrocities in the Soviet Union. Commanders tried to issue orders against violence. Political officers attempted to rein in the troops. But these measures had little effect. The rage was uncontrollable. Soviet soldiers entered German homes. They stopped in their tracks. They saw electricity, fine china, and well-stocked pantries. They saw wealth they had never imagined. This order and prosperity insulted them. Shock turned to jealousy, and jealousy turned to fury. If they couldn't carry the valuables, they smashed them. Furniture was burned, windows were shattered. The NKVD reports describe a landscape of total ruin. A massive human tide moved west. Between January and mid-February of 1945, nearly 8.5 million Germans abandoned their homes. East Prussia was not just conquered, it was erased. The region's deep ties to German culture and history were severed by tank tracks. The horrors of war were visible in every captured village. For the Soviet soldiers, the equation was simple. The war had moved from the Soviet Union to German kitchens. What had happened in Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine was now happening here. They had seen the devastation of their own lands. Now, they were determined to make the Germans pay the bill. By late January, the reckoning was underway. Late January, 1945. The bill for the war had finally come due. The Soviets were determined to make the Germans pay in blood. Berlin began to dissolve into chaos. Sirens wailed every single night. The ground shook from constant bombing. Refugees flooded the train stations. They carried few belongings and terrible stories about the Red Army. Hungary, once a loyal ally, had turned its guns on Germany. Why did the citizens keep working? It wasn't dedication. It was the fear that order was the only thing keeping them alive. Rumors spread faster than official telegrams. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Railroad workers checked the erratic schedules. They knew the truth better than the general staff. The enemy was moving fast. Behind closed doors, Germans turned the dials on their radios. They risked prison to listen to the BBC. They needed facts. Some clung to a naive hope. Perhaps the Soviets would only target the officers in the SS. At first glance, a functioning metropolis. But in reality, a city holding its breath before execution. Public trams still rattled through the rubble. People struggled to get to their shifts. Many stopped going home entirely. They slept on factory floors. They prepared their apartments for relatives whose homes had already turned to dust. Those with gold or connections tried to slip away. But Joseph Goebbels slammed the gates shut. He declared that leaving without a stamp was desertion. Heinrich Himmler sent his squads into the streets. Summary executions spiked. On January 23rd, the regime cleaned house. Resistance members linked to the July plot faced the firing squad, the camera records, propaganda posters flapping in the cold wind. "We will win because we must win." The slogan was plastered everywhere, but it convinced no one. Adolf Hitler had become a ghost. He was rarely seen. Officers visiting the chancellery were shocked. They saw the trembling hands, the shuffling walk, the glazed eyes. The once powerful leader looked like a senile old man. He trusted no one, but the map was turning red. Marshal Ivan Konev's first Ukrainian front tore through the defenses. Krakow fell, Radom fell. The German 17th Army panicked. They fled toward the Oder River. Marshal Georgy Zhukov drove the first Belarusian front straight toward the heart of the Reich. Stalin intervened. He ordered Zhukov to halt and wait for Rokossovsky's forces. Zhukov pushed back. He argued against delay. He ignored the risks and advanced through the Wutherland. Resistance was non-existent. The footage shows Soviet tanks rolling past burning farmhouses without stopping. The Polish soldiers marched with them. Their desire for revenge was absolute. They did not show mercy. Soviet forces treated German civilians with brutal harshness. Retribution was immediate. Events accelerated. February 23rd, Poznan fell. The tanks ground over the cobblestones. The battle was now on Berlin's doorstep. Soviet troops reached the Oder River. They established bridgeheads near Kustrin. The Wehrmacht was caught completely off guard. They had no time to dig trenches. They had no time to lay mines. There was no miracle coming. It was only a matter of weeks. The Soviet boot was poised to crush the Nazi capital. April 20th, 1945. The capital was burning. Adolf Hitler turned 56 that day. But there were no candles on a cake. The gunners of the First Belarusian Front prepared their own celebration. Artillery shells tore through the smoke and slammed into the city center. The barrage began in the morning and did not stop. Day turned into night, but the explosions provided the light. 3 days later, the headlines changed. A Soviet newspaper published the report. Red Army soldiers were walking on German pavement. That same morning, the Nazi leadership made an announcement. Hitler had decided to stay. He would not leave Berlin. The battle was no longer just military. It was a signal to all of Europe. For the civilians, ideology meant nothing. Survival was the only currency. The citizens fled underground. Their destination was the massive bunker at Anhalter Bahnhof, right next to the main station. It was a fortress of steel and concrete. The structure had 3 floors above ground and 2 buried deep below. The walls were 4.5 meters thick. At first glance, a safe haven, but in reality, a suffocating trap. 12,000 people squeezed into 3,600 square meters. The air turned heavy and hot. Movement was impossible. The bathrooms were unreachable through the mass of bodies. One woman sat on the same concrete step for 6 days. She did not move. She could not move. Hygiene collapsed completely. The stench was unbearable. But then the water pipes ran dry. Why did young women run into the line of fire? The shelling was constant, but thirst was stronger than the fear of shrapnel. A single water pump stood outside the station entrance. They ran, filled buckets, and ran back. Not everyone returned. The sound of shrapnel hitting flesh became common. Those who made it back alive became heroes to the weak and the terrified inside. Events accelerated. Inside the bunker, military discipline disintegrated. The most determined soldiers now looked broken. Officers stripped off their insignia. Men found civilian clothes in abandoned apartments and changed quickly. Desertion became an instinct. The proximity of death changed human behavior. Young soldiers panicked. They were desperate to experience life before the end. They wanted to lose their virginity. German girls faced a darker calculation. They feared the arriving Soviet troops. They feared rape. So they turned to the German boys first. Basements became scenes of frantic intimacy. A Norwegian journalist recorded the scene. In the frame, shadows in the corners, uniforms and dresses on the floor. It looked like a search for pleasure. But the camera captures the truth. It was a flight from terror. Chaos ruled the streets above. Shops stood empty. People hunted for supplies like packs of wolves. Gerda Peterson, a young secretary, joined a gang of women. Their target was a Luftwaffe ration cart. They grabbed whatever they could carry. Suddenly, the roar of engines cut through the noise. Soviet planes dived, machine guns strafed the street. Gerda threw herself under the cart. The bullet struck the pavement inches from her face. She looked to the side. A woman lay dead nearby. She was clutching a roll of toilet paper. It was a senseless end. When the power grid failed, darkness brought rumors. Nazi radio called for resistance until the last drop of blood. But paper fell from the sky instead of bombs. Soviet planes dropped millions of leaflets. The message was simple. Fighting is useless. It worked. German soldiers hid these papers in their pockets. They waved them at the Soviets when they surrendered. Other leaflets targeted the women of Berlin. They promised safety. They urged the women to disarm their men. But the civilians did not believe the paper promises. They knew the anger of the approaching army. Hope for a miracle vanished. The city waited for the end. 45,000 against 1.5 million. That was the math of death in Berlin. The odds were impossible, yet the city prepared for the final blow. General Helmut Weidling took command of the defense. His army was a ragtag mix. It included weary Wehrmacht veterans, SS fanatics, and the Volkssturm, teenagers and old men armed with little more than desperation. They faced a red tide advancing from the east and southeast. Why did they fight when the end was clear? Logic dictated surrender, but fear of the Soviet advance was stronger than reason. The defenders fought fiercely. They used every ruin and cellar. But the Soviet numbers were overwhelming. As the battle raged above ground, Adolf Hitler remained sealed in his bunker. He moved phantom armies on a map. He spoke of victories that would never happen. Reality had abandoned him. His final orders were not to save his people, but to destroy them. The Nero Decree went into effect. Bridges were blown. Food stores were torched. Vital infrastructure was sabotaged. Then came the order to flood the subway tunnels. It was a death sentence for thousands of civilians sheltering underground. The sluice gates opened. Cold, black water rushed into the dark stations. Women and children drowned where they sat. The Soviet steamroller moved deeper into the city center. At first glance, a fortress, but in reality, a graveyard. With each passing day, resistance crumbled. The defenders ran out of ammunition and morale. What was once the proud capital of Europe fell apart. Buildings collapsed into the streets. The air smelled of concrete dust, fire, and rotting flesh. The last stands were brave. They were also pointless. Early in the morning of May 2nd, the end arrived. Soviet troops kicked down the doors of the Reich Chancellery. The seat of power was taken. Visual suggestion. In the frame, soldiers climbing the shattered dome of the Reichstag. The red flag snaps in the wind against a gray sky. Berlin, the heart of the Third Reich, had fallen. For the Soviet soldiers, it was a moment of immense triumph. The long road from Stalingrad was over. Victory was in their hands. But the horror was not over. The celebration turned into a frenzy. Relief transformed into aggression. Discipline within the ranks evaporated instantly. The soldiers began to drink. They consumed vodka, industrial alcohol, and anything they could find in the cellars. The footage shows empty bottles littering the streets and soldiers stumbling through the rubble. Political commissars tried to shout orders. Officers tried to restrain their men. It was impossible. The army became a mob. Singing and dancing quickly devolved into looting and violence. Groups of intoxicated soldiers broke into apartments. They weren't just looking for Nazis. They were hunting for valuables, food, and liquor. The violence escalated. German soldiers waved white flags, dropping their weapons. It didn't matter. They were gunned down where they stood. Surrender was not accepted. Visual suggestion. The camera records. A room turned upside down, drawers emptied onto the floor, a broken window. The terror continued for days. There was no police force. There was no law. It is worth noting that not everyone lost their humanity. There were exceptions. A Soviet sapper detachment entered an apartment and found a sick woman. They didn't hurt her. They placed food on her bedside table and left without a word. But such mercy was rare. The general treatment of Berliners was brutal. It went beyond the bounds of war. The fighting had stopped, but the suffering of the population had just begun, especially for the women. A brutal reprisal had begun. Soldier, you are in Germany. Take revenge. These words were painted on wooden signs scattered along the border. The Red Army moved west with a clear mandate. They were not just invaders, they were executioners. The command was simple: show no mercy to the Hitlerites. With this order burning in their minds, the Soviet troops looked at the German population and saw only targets. This included the most vulnerable. It included the women. Why was the city quiet at first? The initial 2 or 3 days of the occupation seemed safe, but the soldiers were simply distracted. They were hunting retreating Wehrmacht units. They were clearing the sectors. Civilians misread this pause as safety. They ventured out. They looted food storage centers. They searched the rubble for fuel. They thought the worst was over. But on the 4th day, the dynamic shifted. An uninterrupted chain of violence began. It wasn't sporadic. It was a wave. The Soviets targeted women of every demographic: young girls, elderly grandmothers, Nazi sympathizers, victims of the regime. The soldiers did not check political affiliations. Most of them were heavily intoxicated. The smell of cheap alcohol mixed with the dust of the ruins. The drunkenness only fueled the brutality. Privacy vanished completely. The soldiers did not drag their victims into the shadows. They committed these crimes in the open, amidst the debris of bombed-out houses, on the sidewalks, in public parks. The camera records, families standing frozen, forced to watch. Husbands and children witnessed the assaults. For the women of Berlin, this terror was not an isolated event. It was simply the next layer of hell. They had already lost their homes to British bombs. They had buried loved ones. They were refugees in their own city. They faced starvation and disease. Now, rape became just another component of survival in the wasteland. An observer noted a chilling fact: the violence had become routine. Margaret Bovary, a German journalist, documented this collapse of civilization. She kept a survival diary throughout the Battle of Berlin. Her entry for May 8, 1945, paints a stark picture. She rode a bicycle through the rubble. Beside her was a young girl. The girl looked disheveled. The footage shows. The girl's eyes are hollow, her clothes torn. She had been a prisoner of the Russians for 14 days. She was well fed, but the price was repeated assault. Bovary noted the normality of it all. A neighbor tried to resist. A soldier shot him on the spot, but Bovary also recorded the desperate rumors of the occupied. Mrs. Krauss remained untouched. She insisted it was because she wore glasses. A theory spread: the Russians do not touch women who wear glasses. Bovary wrote that she wanted to verify this. At first glance, a drunken mob, but in reality, a discerning force. They were intoxicated, yet they still distinguished between the young and the old. Bovary called this progress. Betrayal struck everyone. Jews and anti-fascists emerged from cellars to welcome the Red Army. They expected liberators. They found predators. Inga Deutschkron hid with her mother for years. She heard the rumble of Russian T-34 tanks. She felt joy. She stepped out of the basement to greet them. A soldier approached. He was smiling, but he didn't shake her hand. He grabbed her clothing. He murmured a simple command: "Come, Frau. Come, lady." Inga broke free and ran to her mother. Her mother sighed deeply. The realization hit hard. So it is true, after all. They hoped their Jewish identity cards would serve as shields. They were wrong. The soldiers could not read the German text. The cards were useless paper. Events accelerated. The violence moved from the streets into the underground. Soldiers descended into the bunkers. They entered the basements where civilians hid from the artillery. Flashlights cut through the darkness. They raped women in front of their children. Sometimes they selected specific victims. Other times, they attacked in groups. Age was not a defense. They targeted 70-year-old women with the same ferocity as teenagers. The first anti-fascist mayor of Charlottenburg filed a grim report. He noted that the looting was industrial in scale. Warehouses, stores, private apartments, everything was stripped. But the sexual violence was the dominant theme. A woman could not escape unless she remained invisible. The scale of the crime is difficult to visualize. It wasn't just the bunkers. The terror followed the civilians back to their apartments. Specific police records survived the chaos. A report sent to the Rathaus Spandau details a single night, May 6, 1945, 2:30 in the morning. The sound of shattering glass broke the silence. 3 Russian soldiers smashed a hallway window. They forced a tenant to unlock the main door. They moved room by room. On the 2nd floor, they found an apartment. 2 young women were sleeping. A baby lay between them. The soldiers didn't attack immediately. They sat on the bed. They lit cigarettes. Smoke filled the small room. They demanded the women submit. One woman tried to scream. A soldier leveled a pistol at her face. The other woman called out for her mother. A soldier grabbed her. He forced her into the next room. He held her down with a machine gun while he rifled through suitcases for valuables. Meanwhile, the other 2 soldiers remained in the bedroom. There was no escape for the woman left behind. The police report ends there. The violence was widespread. June 28, 1945. A desperate document landed on a desk in Berlin-Reinickendorf. It was a petition describing a chaotic attack on May 4th. 2 Russian soldiers kicked down the door of a private residence. They were heavily intoxicated. The homeowners were an elderly couple. The wife was 62. The husband was 66. The soldiers did not ask for money. They raped the woman while her husband watched. Then they raised their weapons and shot him dead. But the horror did not end there. Later that day, a 3rd soldier arrived. He found the grieving widow in a neighbor's apartment. He didn't care about the body next door. He raped her again. In her statement, the woman wrote a single defense. "My husband was not a member of any Nazi organization." She demanded a hearing with the commander. The paper was filed. The result is unknown. Swiss journalist Max Schnetzer recorded these events in his diaries. He walked through Dahlem, the wealthy residential district. The scenes were medieval. In the street, a father tried to shield his young daughter with his body. The soldiers, described as Mongols, didn't argue. They drove a 3-edged bayonet into his stomach. He collapsed on the pavement. Inside the houses, the violence was systematic. Schnetzer described dozens of Russians lining up in front of solitary women. The frenzy was total. The soldiers were so consumed by adrenaline and alcohol that they didn't notice their victims were dying. Some women swallowed cyanide capsules during the act. Others died from massive internal bleeding. Many tried to fight. They bit hands and scratched faces. But the response was brutal. Soldiers struck them on the head with heavy rifle butts. Men who threw themselves at the attackers were cut down by automatic fire immediately. The hunt spilled out of the houses. Women and girls ran through gardens. They scrambled up to the rooftops. When the pursuit got too close, they leaped into the void. Suicide was preferable to capture. Those cornered in rooms faced a different torture. Soldiers pried open their jaws. They forced raw vodka down their throats until the victims blacked out. Why did the Red Army behave this way? It seemed like pure sadism, but in reality, it was a complex mix of vengeance and relief. Schnetzer notes a strange duality. Not every soldier was a monster. When asked about the behavior in Wannsee, a fellow journalist gave a chilling answer. He said they acted part like pigs, part like angels. In one apartment, a woman died from abuse. Next door, soldiers shared their rations. They were like a hailstorm. It destroys half the harvest, but leaves the rest untouched. Testimonies confirm this unpredictability. In one case, an entire family prepared to hang themselves. They had just watched the mass rape of their neighbors. They stood on chairs with ropes around their necks. Suddenly, a Soviet officer burst in. He didn't attack. He was compassionate. He stopped them and promised protection. In another sector, a group of soldiers attacked a girl in front of her father. Their own comrades intervened and stopped the assault at gunpoint. A local mayor from Breslau documented this confusion. He saw a Russian truck driver give a ride to an elderly woman with a broken cart. He shared his last piece of bread with German children. Yet, this same driver could set an ambush in a cemetery an hour later. He would wait among the tombstones to rob and rape unaccompanied girls. Some experts compared them to primitive children. They could be extremely kind and then brutally ruthless. Peter Bloch lived through the occupation in Kleinmachnow. He wrote about the Russians with bewilderment. At first glance, they were Huns, but in reality, they were innocent children. They could calmly shoot a civilian. 10 minutes later, they would stand in front of a stall of young rabbits, laughing and admiring the animals. You never knew which version of the soldier stood before you. Junior Sergeant Ratkina, a telephone operator, provided the psychological key. She gave a testimony that explained the hate. She remembered a German woman lying naked on the ground. A live grenade was placed between her legs. Ratkina admitted, "Now I feel ashamed. But back then, I didn't." The feelings of the first days were different from the feelings of the first months, but even the vengeance had limits. 5 German girls came to the battalion commander. They were weeping. The unit's gynecologist examined them. The report was grim. Irregular wounds, underwear soaked in blood. They had been raped all night. The commander was furious. He ordered the entire battalion to form up. The soldiers stood in rows. The officers told the girls, "Go and look. If you recognize anyone, point them out. We will shoot them on the spot. Rank does not matter." The battalion waited in silence. The girls sat and cried. They looked at the faces, but they shook their heads. They didn't want more blood. They refused to identify the rapists. The commander gave each girl a loaf of bread. They left. Junior Sergeant Ratkina reflected on this paradox. She looked at the German houses. They were white. They had tiled roofs and blooming roses. In Russia, everything was ash. She wanted to hurt them. She wanted to see their tears. It was impossible to suddenly become good after 4 years of hell. It would take decades to learn pity again. Thus ended the war, and thus began the occupation. It was the darkest chapter of human history. For the women of Berlin, the falling bombs were replaced by a new terror. The street fighting was over, but the survival tactics were just beginning. April 1945. Beauty became a curse. To survive, German women had to destroy their own appearance. They did not just neglect their hygiene, they actively sabotaged it. Women took cold ash from fireplaces and smeared it into their pores. They cut their hair short with kitchen shears. They raided closets for men's trousers and oversized coats. The goal was to look formless. Some wore 3 or 4 layers of clothing to appear bulky and unrecognizable. It wasn't about modesty. It was camouflage. Why did they scream typhus? It seemed like a desperate lie. But fear of disease was the only thing stronger than lust. Women painted spots on their skin. They feigned the shaking chills of fever. They claimed to have venereal diseases. Even a drunk soldier hesitated before an infection. The threat of sickness acted as an invisible shield. When the soldiers heard the word typhus, they often backed away. But disguise was not always enough. The primary tactic was total disappearance. Women vanished into the architecture of the city. They spent weeks in damp, coal-dusted basements. They squeezed into crawl spaces beneath floorboards. Some sought refuge in houses already occupied by the elderly or children. They hoped the soldiers would show mercy to a grandmother or an infant. Often, this hope was in vain. In the frame, a group of women wrapped in rags scuttling across a ruined street. They looked more like ghosts than people. There was no safety in isolation. When food ran out, they emerged in tight groups. They walked shoulder to shoulder. Strength in numbers was their only deterrent. If stopped, they offered bribes instantly: a gold watch, a wedding ring, a hidden loaf of bread. Negotiations were desperate. They pleaded with the soldiers, appealing to any shred of decency left in the men. Community efforts also played a critical role. Entire apartment blocks turned into fortresses. Women dragged heavy furniture across hallways to create barricades. They organized shifts. One watched the street through a cracked shutter while others slept. A whistle or a scream served as the alarm. At first glance, a chaotic scramble for life, but in reality, a calculated strategy of manipulation. When hiding failed, a darker strategy emerged. Women sought the wolf. They looked for high-ranking officers, men with stars on their shoulders. The logic was brutal but rational. Submit to one powerful man to escape the uncontrolled brutality of 20 soldiers. It was a transaction, sex for protection. This led to a strange paradox. The victims became players in a dangerous game. Strictly transactional relationships sometimes evolved. Diaries from the period record moments of shared meals and quiet conversations between German women and Soviet officers. The camera captures a Soviet officer and a German woman sitting on a park bench. They are talking. It looks almost normal. One specific account illustrates this shift. An anonymous woman in Berlin described her reality after enduring a series of brutal assaults in May. She didn't just give up, She got angry. Her diary records the moment. "I exclaimed aloud, 'Damn it!' She made a hard decision. She needed a powerful officer. She cleaned her face. She practiced her Russian phrases. She went out to hunt for a protector. She wondered if she looked too broken to be wanted. But action gave her power. She was no longer prey. She was planning. Any advantage was used. A few words of Russian could save a life. Knowledge of Soviet culture created a fragile bridge. They used every tool available to stop the violence. But behind every survival story lay silent suffering. 1,900,000. That is the estimated number of German women raped by Soviet soldiers during and after the war. The violence did not end with the ceasefire. For women across Germany, the occupation brought a new, silent terror. In Berlin alone, the statistics are staggering. Some reports cite 20,000 victims. Others suggest figures ranging from 100,000 to nearly 1 million. Many women were not attacked just once. They were targeted multiple times. Why did the violence escalate to such levels? The war was technically over, but the thirst for revenge was stronger than military discipline. 10,000 women died as a direct result of these assaults. Some died from injuries. Others took their own lives. The brutality was not limited to the capital. It spread to the countryside, to small towns, and to refugee columns. No area was safe. Women of all ages became targets. But surviving the assault was often just the beginning. A wave of unwanted pregnancies forced the shattered administration to act. The Ministry of the Interior could not ignore the crisis. They ordered the creation of special wards in large cities to handle the medical fallout. One such ward opened in the Neukölln district of Berlin. The records from this facility tell a grim story. There was a sharp spike in abortion requests. From June 7, 1945 to June 17, 1946, the health office approved 995 terminations. The cause was listed simply: rape. At first glance, a standard hospital procedure, but in reality, an assembly line of trauma. Doctors and nurses worked in ruins. Resources were scarce. The medical staff itself was a strange mix. Some were anti-fascists, newly appointed by the occupiers. Others were former Nazi Party members, suspended from private practice but brought back for this specific task. They had no other option. The volume of patients was too high. But access to the procedure was not automatic. Women had to provide detailed statements. They had to explain their circumstances in writing. The archives show handwritten affidavits on scraps of paper. The ink is often smudged. The language mixes social desperation with the lingering rhetoric of racial hygiene. One woman detailed an attack on April 27, 1945. She begged for an abortion. She already had an illegitimate child. She lived with her parents in a crowded home with other small children. There was no room for another life. Another applicant described being raped on the road to Potsdam. She was single. Her mother had been dead for 15 years. She noted that her father was half Jewish, and she had not seen him in 6 years. In these conditions, she wrote, bringing a child into the world was impossible. It got worse. On August 20, 1945, a woman filed a report. She had been attacked by a soldier she described as a Mongol on her way to work. It happened on the second day of Easter. Her statement is filled with disgust. She wrote that carrying the pregnancy to term would kill her. She feared leaving her existing children motherless. The requests came from everywhere. Refugees fleeing West Prussia were frequent victims. One woman, a mother of 3 children between 5 and 11, had lost her husband. He was a soldier who never returned. She had been bombed out twice. She fled in January, only to be attacked on her way to work. She fought back, but it was useless. Now, she sought help to ensure her children did not lose their only remaining parent. There was no turning back for these women. Beyond the pregnancies, there was the silent epidemic of venereal disease. Doctors like Anne-Marie Durand-Weber worked on the front lines. She returned to a first aid station in a bombed-out section of Berlin. Her days were spent testing women and girls for infections and preparing them for abortions. Durand-Weber's reports are clinical and cold. She noted that the situation did not improve quickly. Rapes, disease, and mass abortions continued well into 1946. The sheer number of procedures serves as the only real metric for the scale of the violence. The system was overwhelmed. Thus ended the war for millions of women. 1945. The medical system in Berlin was on the verge of collapse. Doctors and social workers scrambled to adapt. They were not treating a disease. They were managing the aftermath of mass violence. Records from the Neukölln Health Office tell a dry, terrifying story. Thousands of applications piled up on desks. Forms were stamped in haste. The spike in abortion procedures was vertical. It wasn't just a statistic. It was a measure of desperation. Why did the Red Army soldiers commit these crimes? It seemed they had lost all humanity. But the answer is not found in simple savagery. At first glance, they were monsters. But in reality, they were men broken by 4 years of hell. To understand the violence, we must rewind the clock. Summer of 1944. The location is the Yanovska concentration camp in Ukraine. Soviet troops arrived as liberators. But there was no celebration. The fleeing Germans had left a welcome gift. Fresh corpses lay in the heat. The smell hit the soldiers first. It was a thick, sweet stench of decay. The sandy soil around the camp was moving. Millions of flies fed on the dead. The Germans had not dug deep graves. They simply tossed bodies into ditches and kicked loose sand over them. Limbs stuck out of the ground. The footage shows soldiers covering their noses with rags. Some are vomiting. This was their first encounter with industrial death. The forensic details were brutal. Hands tied behind backs with wire. Bullet holes in the base of the skulls. But the women's bodies were worse. Their heads were patchy and bloody. The German guards had dragged them to the execution pits by their hair. Clumps of human hair littered the sand like dead grass. The archives preserve the horror. Prisoners wrote down what they saw. One name appears constantly: Oberfuhrer Vilgas, the camp commander. He did not just kill, he played. Witnesses describe his favorite Sunday activity. He stood on the balcony with his wife. Below, guards threw small children into the air. Vilgas raised his rifle. He shot them like clay pigeons before they hit the ground. Beside him, his 9-year-old daughter clapped her hands. Her voice rang out over the camp. "Daddy, again, again!" The Soviet propaganda machine seized these stories. They did not hide the horror. They amplified it. Political officers ensured every soldier saw the photos: starving skeletons, piles of shoes, gas chambers. The message from the newspapers and radios was singular. It did not ask for justice. It asked for blood. The slogan was simple: kill the German. Hatred became the fuel of the army. The soldiers marched west with a specific mindset. Revenge was not a sin. It was a duty. Events accelerated. With every mile westward, they found more evidence, more pits, more camps. Then they found the survivors, Soviet citizens, girls as young as 16. They were skin and bones, kidnapped from their villages to work as slaves. They cried in the arms of the soldiers. They spoke of beatings, hunger, and humiliation. The soldiers listened. Their knuckles turned white on their rifles. The decomposing bodies in the ditches did not speak, but they demanded payment. Then the Red Army crossed the border into Prussia, German soil. The landscape changed instantly. They left behind the scorched earth of Russia and Ukraine. Suddenly, they were in a land of white cottages, manicured gardens, lace curtains. The contrast was blinding. The people in these villages looked healthy. They lived as if the war was a rumor. They had not seen their homes burned. They had not watched their children starve. To the Soviet soldier, this normalcy was an insult. It was proof that the entire German nation had fattened itself on Soviet blood. The propaganda had done its work. The soldiers did not see civilians, they saw the enemy. Collective punishment became the unspoken rule. Discipline evaporated. The commanders had a military objective: take Berlin. Everything else was secondary. If a soldier looted a house, officers looked away. If a soldier dragged a woman into an alley, no one intervened. The chain of command broke down at the platoon level. Alcohol poured onto the fire. Supply lines brought vodka, but soldiers also raided German cellars. Drunkenness was not an infraction, it was the norm. Alcohol lowered the last barriers of civilized behavior. A drunk soldier with a submachine gun, is not a soldier. He's a force of nature. Aggression peaked, empathy vanished, psychology played the final card. These men had survived Stalingrad and Kursk. They had watched their friends die in mud and snow for years. They were desensitized to death. Violence was their only language. The laws of war did not apply here. This was a war of annihilation. In this chaos, the worst human impulses took the wheel: greed, lust, rage. The soldiers took what they wanted because they believed they had paid for it in advance. The German population became the currency of their revenge. Thus ended the illusion of a clean victory. Justice denied. Total denial. That was Stalin's initial response to the accusations coming from Germany. The Kremlin refused to listen. During the war, the Soviet leadership built a specific image. The Red Army was a force of liberation. They brought freedom to Europe. They brought justice to the oppressed. Acknowledging mass sexual violence destroyed this carefully crafted narrative. Why did the leadership turn a blind eye? It seemed like simple ignorance, but in reality, it was a calculated political move. Admitting the crimes meant admitting a loss of control. Therefore, reports of mass rapes were labeled as enemy propaganda. The state media claimed these were lies invented to tarnish the glory of the victors. The propaganda machine worked non-stop. It portrayed the Soviet soldier as a moral giant, a disciplined hero who stood above the fascist beasts he had defeated. But there was a second, darker layer to this silence. Commanders often justified the violence. They constructed a convenient narrative. The Nazis had burned Russian villages and slaughtered civilians on Soviet soil. Now, the pendulum swung back. The atrocities committed by soldiers were viewed as retaliation. It was seen as understandable behavior in the chaotic aftermath of battle. But on the ground, the reality could not be hidden. Military authorities were forced to act. Discipline was breaking down. If a soldier was suspected of rape, an investigation began. The process was crude and direct. The files described the scene: a lineup of exhausted soldiers in dirty tunics standing against a wall. Investigators used direct identification. The victims, usually terrified German women, were brought to the unit. They were urged to point out their attackers. This was psychological torture. The women had to relive the trauma. They had to look into the faces of the men who had assaulted them. Yet, many found the strength to raise a hand and point. Soviet archives record a specific incident involving a group of soldiers. They were accused of raping a German girl. The assault had been brutal. The command did not brush this aside. They brought the accused before their superiors. The officers demanded justice. The girl was brought into the room. She was shaking. Fear paralyzed her, but she managed to identify the culprits. The response from the command was swift. The soldiers were tried immediately. The verdict was harsh. In many cases, it meant execution by firing squad. The sound of rifle shots served a specific purpose. It was not just punishment, it was a deterrent. The leadership needed to send a message. Such acts would not be tolerated, even in the madness of 1945. But this was only the beginning. Not all justice came from tribunals. Inside the barracks, a different war was fought. Some soldiers took it upon themselves to punish the perpetrators. They believed the honor of their unit was at stake. They did not want the crimes of a few to stain the reputation of the whole army. Confrontations turned physical. Honest soldiers cornered the rapists. They beat them. They administered on-the-spot punishment. Violence was the only language the offenders understood. The goal was to scrub the shame from their regiment. Victims also sought their own justice. German women showed remarkable courage. They tracked down attackers. They demanded retribution. They refused to be silent victims in a defeated land. However, the obstacles were immense. The chaos of the battlefield often buried the truth. Smoke and confusion made consistent justice impossible. Many victims never came forward. Fear silenced them. Shame locked their mouths. They were afraid of being judged by their own neighbors. They were afraid the Soviet officers would not believe them. The military environment was strictly patriarchal. Some superiors laughed at the accusations. They dismissed the women's tears. This reluctance allowed many criminals to walk free. There was no turning back for those who spoke up. Soldiers who tried to stop the rapes faced dangerous consequences. They were accused of causing division. Officers labeled them as troublemakers who weakened the ranks. Pursuing justice became a risk to their own careers and safety. Despite these threats, some persisted. They were driven by a rigid sense of duty. They refused to let the Red Army descend into banditry. These internal struggles highlight the complexity of the era. It was a battle between maintaining order and facing the ugly reality of war crimes. Fortunately, the anarchy did not last forever. The war ended. The occupation zones were established. Military police restored control on the streets. The era of unchecked violence slowly faded. The files were closed. 10 to 15 years in the Gulag. That was the new price for a single night of violence. Reports of mass rapes flooded the desks of the Soviet High Command. The sheer volume of complaints threatened to destroy the carefully crafted image of the liberating Red Army. Moscow realized the situation was spiraling out of control. Why did the leadership suddenly demand discipline? It wasn't out of pity for the German people, but the political cost of the chaos had become too high to ignore. The Presidium of the Supreme Soviet acted fast. They signed a strict directive. Rape was no longer treated as a minor infraction. It became a serious state crime against the reputation of the USSR. High-ranking officers received new clear orders: restore order immediately or face the consequences. The message was simple: respect the population or disappear into the camps. Commanders began a brutal purge of their own ranks. In Magdeburg, the crackdown was immediate. The commander did not wait for tribunals or paperwork. The footage implies a firing squad lines up in a courtyard. Soldiers caught in the act were dragged before their units. The verdict was delivered on the spot. A bullet. These public executions served as a grim warning. The leadership wanted every soldier to see the body of a comrade on the ground and understand that the party was finished. Propaganda officers shifted their rhetoric. Yesterday, they preached vengeance. Today, they spoke of honor and socialist morality. But this was only the beginning. At first glance, a moral campaign to save civilians, but in reality, a pragmatic move to secure geopolitical leverage. Physical isolation became the next step. The command issued orders to pull troops out of German homes. Soldiers were forced into damp barracks and makeshift military camps. Comfort vanished. In some districts, the measures were even more drastic. Entire villages were evacuated. Locals were pushed out. Troops moved in. The military administration tried to build a physical wall between the conquerors and the conquered. Freedom of movement ended. A soldier could no longer wander the streets at will. In the frame, a checkpoint blocking a village road. To visit a German home, a private required written authorization, a piece of paper signed by a direct commander. Without it, a patrol could arrest him instantly. The goal was to limit unsupervised interactions, to keep Soviet men away from German women by any means necessary. However, the chaos of 1945 made enforcement difficult. The front lines were messy. The occupation was messier. Some commanders ruled with an iron fist, checking every document. Others simply looked the other way. They ignored the screams coming from the basements. They were too tired or too complicit to intervene. Events accelerated. There was another enemy the commanders could not defeat: alcohol. Drunkenness fueled the violence. It removed the last inhibitions of the troops. The administration tried to crack down. They smashed distilleries and confiscated supplies. The camera records, soldiers stumbling through rubble, passing bottles, weapons slung loosely over their shoulders. But the bans failed. Alcohol was everywhere. The lack of strict control meant the violence continued to simmer. The measures reduced the scale of the atrocities, but they could not erase the dark side of the liberation. The narrative shifted to a darker reality. Rape was not just a breakdown of discipline, it was evolving into a weapon of war. Late 1944. The borders were crossed. When historians discuss the mass assaults of World War II, they often focus on Berlin. But the map of violence was much larger. German women were not the only victims. The Red Army moved west. They entered Hungary. They swept through Romania. In these territories, the sound of tank treads was often followed by screams. The scale of the crimes in these regions mirrored the horrors seen in Germany itself. But then, the geography changed. Why did they attack their own allies? It seemed illogical. The propaganda preached brotherhood, but the instinct for violence often ignored political borders. The Red Army entered northern Yugoslavia. It was the winter of 1945. Yugoslavia was a friendly nation. The locals initially welcomed the Soviets as liberators. They offered food and shelter. In return, many received brutality. The number of victims here was lower than in enemy Germany, but the nature of the violence remained identical. Soviet political officers worked hard. They lectured the troops. Respect the Yugoslavs. They are partisans. They are brothers in arms. The orders were written on paper. Leave the families alone. Respect local laws. But orders often vanished when the officers looked away. The soldiers ignored the lectures. Marshal Tito sent urgent messages to Moscow. The archives contain these letters. He complained bitterly about the misconduct. The Kremlin had to react. Disciplinary battalions filled up. Executions were staged. A squad lines up. A volley is fired. The rapist falls. Soviet commanders used these executions as grim warnings to the ranks. Yet, the suffering continued in the shadows. Not every criminal was caught. Many escaped justice entirely. The presence of the liberators became a source of fear for Yugoslav families. But this was only one side of the coin. It is a comfortable myth that only the Soviets committed these crimes. Supporting the claim that wartime rape is a complex issue is a hard fact. The Western Allies were not innocent. American GIs, British Tommies, French regulars, they also stained their warpath. For the Americans, it began in France. June 1944. The liberation of Normandy. At first glance, a celebration of freedom, but in reality, a hunt for prey. Propaganda had painted a distorted picture. American soldiers believed myths about French women. They viewed them as morally loose. They saw them as available targets. The Army Command did little to correct this. When reports of rape surfaced, they blamed French society. They cited social problems. As the numbers rose, the leadership found a scapegoat. African American soldiers were disproportionately targeted by military courts. They faced harsh prosecutions. They were punished severely. But the violence did not stop. It escalated as the front moved into Germany. Events accelerated. April 1945. The advance was rapid. In that month alone, 37 American soldiers were convicted of rape. But the real numbers were buried in the chaos. The assaults were brutal. The files describe pistol whippings, women beaten unconscious, oral and anal penetration. The statistics are cold and terrifying. About half of the rapists tried in the post-war months were accused of assaulting teenagers. The ages shocked the conscience. The youngest reported victim, 7 years old. The oldest, 69. Researchers estimate 14,000 rapes by American troops in Western Europe. Most occurred on German soil. The U.S. National Archives suggest this is a conservative estimate. The dark figure is higher. British soldiers also participated. Their sector was quieter, but not safe. Many soldiers felt the rush of total victory. They looked at the defeated population with contempt. They saw property, not people. Defense lawyers later claimed the German women were willing. The bruised bodies suggested otherwise. Resistance was met with force. Then came the French forces, Stuttgart, April 1945. The city fell to the French army. In the frame, tanks rolling through rubble-strewn streets, civilians peeked from behind curtains. The occupation was chaotic. Soldiers were billeted in private homes. There were no barracks. There was no separation. The proximity was dangerous. Hundreds of rape reports flooded the police stations in days. The French soldiers viewed German women as war trophies. They felt entitled to their bodies. Commanders looked the other way. Like their American allies, the French pointed fingers at colonial troops, North Africans, West Africans. It was a convenient excuse. Nazi propaganda had warned of this exact scenario. Now, Allied commanders used racism to cover their own lack of discipline. These incidents reveal a global pattern. The uniform changed. The flag changed. The behavior remained. Rape was part of the sexual conquest of the war. Military authorities minimized the reports. They blamed the victims. They cited the stress of combat. German women, already living in ruins, had to endure this final trauma. The peace treaty did not bring peace to them. It brought silence. History recorded the victory but forgot the cost. 1945. Spring arrived, but it brought no warmth to Berlin. The Soviet army advanced with a singular purpose: revenge. German propaganda had done its job too well. For years, the radio screamed that the Russians were savages from the east. Now, those savages were at the gate. The panic was absolute. Why did the population freeze in terror? The Wehrmacht promised protection, but the soldiers were gone, dead in the snow or captured in the cauldrons. Only the vulnerable remained: women, children, the elderly. As the T-34 tanks rolled over the cobblestones, the civilians surrendered. They didn't just wave hands, they hung bedsheets, tablecloths, and white shirts from every window. The streets became a sea of white fabric. But the surrender did not stop the anger. The Soviet soldiers saw the ruins of their own homeland in their minds. They wanted payment. Resistance was non-existent. The Volkssturm militias threw down their rifles. Boys of 15 and men of 60 vanished into basements. But the women had nowhere to hide. The rumors of mass rape turned into reality within hours. It spread faster than the fire consuming the buildings. Fear dictated every movement. It wasn't just fear of death. It was fear of defilement. The Soviets tried to manage the chaos. Commanders set up medical clinics to treat the explosion of venereal diseases. They posted signs. They offered medicine. The waiting rooms remained empty. The women whispered to each other in bread lines. They believed the clinics were traps. They thought the doctors would identify the healthy ones and ship them east to the gulags of Siberia. To them, a disease was safer than a Soviet train car. There was no turning back. The NKVD arrived behind the frontline troops. They didn't bring order. They brought lists. Their black trucks patrolled the ruins, hunting for saboteurs. But the German people were too exhausted to sabotage anything. They lived on a diet of sawdust bread and false hope. A belief took root in the cellars: the war myth. People whispered that the Americans would turn on the Soviets. They waited for Western tanks to drive the Russians out. They waited for weeks, then months. The American tanks never came. At first glance, a defeated nation accepting its fate, but in reality, a population driven to madness. Suicide rates spiked. It wasn't a quiet decision. Fathers shot their families. Women carried cyanide capsules in their pockets like loose change. Some threw themselves into the Spree River rather than face the soldiers at night. The sound of glass breaking or a door kicking open triggered mass panic. Women smeared ash on their faces to look older. They wore rags to look sick. They stopped washing to repel the attackers. But these measures rarely worked. The violence left marks that time could not erase. The footage shows women walking through rubble, staring at the ground. They do not look at the camera. They clutch their coats tight. The trauma went deeper than physical injury. It destroyed the social fabric. A victim of rape in 1945 did not receive sympathy. She received silence. Husbands returned from prisoner camps and looked at their wives with disgust. The shame was heavy. Families stopped talking at the dinner table. The victims felt dirty, guilty, and isolated. They were treated as if they had collaborated with the enemy, simply by surviving. 9 months later, the consequences cried in the cribs. Thousands of children were born from these assaults. The Germans called them Russenkinder. They were branded from birth. Mothers often abandoned them on church steps or in state orphanages. If they kept them, the children grew up in a house filled with resentment. They were living reminders of the defeat. The breakdown of the family was total. Nazi society was built on the image of the strong Aryan protector. But the men had failed. They lost the war. They lost the country. And they failed to protect their own homes. This failure turned into aggression. Domestic violence skyrocketed. Alcoholism became an epidemic. Trust evaporated from the streets. Neighbors looked at neighbors with suspicion. During the bombings, they had shared food. Now, they hoarded secrets. The community fractured into millions of isolated individuals, each guarding their own trauma. The camera records: an old man sitting on a pile of bricks, smoking a cigarette end. He watches a Soviet patrol pass. His face is blank. This violence reshaped the German identity. They stopped seeing themselves as perpetrators of the Holocaust. They began to see themselves as victims of the Red Army. The guilt for Auschwitz was buried under the pain of the occupation. This sense of victimhood created a complex national scar. It fueled a deep, quiet resentment toward the East that lasted for decades. 70 years have passed. The women who endured the spring of 1945 are gone. The world remembers the newsreels of the flag over the Reichstag. It remembers the cheering crowds in London and New York. But the history books often skip the basements of Berlin. The story cuts off here. The archives hold the numbers, but the silence of those millions of women speaks louder than any statistic.